As we get there. Um, I am so very excited for this morning's forum. I'm a huge Harry Potter fan, so I've been looking forward to this basically for months. So I'm so very excited to welcome Vanessa Zoltan, who is the co-host and co-creator of the podcast Harry Potter and the Sacred Text. Vanessa has a BA in English Literature and Creative Writing from Washington University in St. Louis, an MS in Nonprofit Management from the University of Pennsylvania, and an MDiv from Harvard Divinity School. Welcome. We are so excited to have you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here with you all this morning. So I professionally treat secular things as if they were sacred. And so what I'm going to talk about this morning is a little bit of what that means to me, why I do it, and then give some examples of what we do with Harry Potter and how we believe that treating Harry Potter as sacred is a really beautiful way to engage with community. So I, as most divinity school graduates are, an atheist Jew. And I was when I went to divinity school, and I was when I left divinity school. I thought I was going to be a teacher. I worked in education for 10 years before I went to divinity school. And after 10 years of working in education, I just got really frustrated. I was working in ed reform, and I just realize that we know how to fix education in this country. We just don't want to, because we don't believe that poor brown and Black children deserve to learn. We don't want them to learn as a society. And that to me seemed like a soul problem, not a money problem, not a politics problem. And so I wanted to go where I could think about that. And so I ended up at divinity school. And it turned out a study came out about the organization that I was working for that had spent hundreds of millions of dollars trying to work on ed reform, essentially saying that in the 15 years of the organization's history that we had effectively done no good for kids. And so I wanted to do something that I knew was good. And so I was like, well, sitting with dying people, like that is good. Like that can't be bad. Sitting with people in prison, keeping them company, that can't be bad. That, to use Jewish language, is a mitzvah. So I went to divinity school to train to do that. The reason I'm an atheist is all four of my grandparents are Holocaust survivors. They all spent time in Auschwitz, and all of them lost God. They were all raised ultra-Orthodox and then all left the camps because of various things as atheists. And so I was raised very observant. We went to temple every Friday night. I was bat mitzvahed in a conservative synagogue. We were kosher, but also very much raised as an atheist and by atheists. My grandfather, by the time my grandmother died, he was no longer kosher, to say the least. I was working at a cafe between his apartment and his synagogue. When his wife of 60 years, my grandmother, passed away, he was going to temple twice a day, every day, to say the mourner's prayer for her, and would stop on his way home from synagogue at the cafe where I was working and would get a bacon, egg, and cheese sandwich. So shul twice a day, but bacon in between, and would overtip me for the sandwich, of course. And so, as you can probably already tell from what I've said, is that I'm somebody who, my relationship with God is fraught, because I do not feel inspired by any religion that it holds human suffering in a way that is meaningful to me. And I do love stories that try to account for human suffering, the Akedah, Christ on the cross, but none of them, to me, no church holds for me the suffering that my grandparents went through. My dad's brother, and my dad was born in 1948. His brother and sister were killed in the war, right? So this is, I don't have any understanding of God that holds that. And yet I do believe that there are certain things that only conversations with something bigger than ourselves can even try to hold. So I went to divinity school with those two things in mind, not quite understanding what it would teach me, but knowing that I wanted to focus on spiritual care and counseling, and really wanting to leave with the skill of being able to sit with people in a meaningful way. And I did my first unit of clinical pastoral education and found it to be really rewarding. I felt a little out of place. I really liked my cohort, but it was two priests, two Orthodox rabbis, and me. And I was like, this is like a bad joke, but I didn't like, I was the punchline. And then, so my second year of divinity school, I went to my favorite professor, Stephanie Paulsell, and I asked her, I said, I really want to learn how to pray. I really struggled with clinical pastoral education because I didn't know how to pray with people. And I faked it all summer. And I would like to learn how to do this for real. You know, I'm here to learn how to sit with people. She said, great, you should go to a rabbi. I'm a minister. And I was like, no, I can't go to a rabbi. Every time I say Jewish prayers, every time I say the Shema or the Amidah, I'm reminded of the gas chambers and like the people who said those prayers there. I'm reminded of my aunt and uncle. Like I can't do it. And so she was like, okay, I don't know what you want for me. And I was like, I would like for you to teach me how to pray using my favorite book, a book that I know won't offend me, Jane Eyre. And she was like, great, I have no idea what that's going to look like, but let's figure that out together. And so she and I did an independent study for 16 weeks where what I did was pick prayers from the books, and we would talk about different ways in which I could, in theory, pray with the book. So there are a lot of famous quotes from Jane Eyre. I'd rather be happy than dignified, or I can live alone if self-respect requires me so to do. And these were just, sparklets, right, of florilegium that I would bring to her. And I'd say, okay, how do I pray? And she would try to teach me. And every time I was like, I don't know if I can do it. So we ended up having these academic conversations where she assigned me to read Guido II and learn about Lectio Divina, or she assigned for me to read Maimonides and his idea of charities prayer. And so we were engaging with all of these different ideas as to how to treat a secular text as if it was sacred. And finally, after a semester together, we decided that treating this text as sacred required three things if the text is not considered to be divinely inspired as sacred. One is commitment or rigor. So, it's that you are going to engage with the text no matter sort of your mood and no matter what you're going through with the text. So the idea is just that you believe that the text can give you endless blessings. The more time you spend with the text, the more gifts it will give you. The second was practice. And with that, we meant that you were going to engage in religious practices with it. Use Lectio Divina, Florilegia, do your 5 minutes of reading Proust every morning, whatever it is, a real commitment to practice. And the third was community. That in order to truly treat a text as sacred, and I know all of you know this because you're here on a Sunday morning, you have to do so in community. Otherwise, you risk, only having the same idea over and over again. You risk becoming a fundamentalist in your own ideas, not pushing yourself, and just giving up, right? Like, oh, I don't want to this morning, I'm not gonna. So we discovered these three things. We started to practice treating Jane Eyre as sacred. And eventually Stephanie said, okay, go find your community. And I was deeply offended. I was like, oh, I thought you were my community. And she was like, no, I've got my church. You have to go find your community. And so I was interning at a community center at the time. And so I sent a newsletter out saying, on Tuesday nights from 7 to 8:30, I am going to be treating Jane Eyre as sacred if anyone would like to join me. And 4 women came. And we did that for 9 months, and it was absolutely beautiful. We did Lectio Divina. I got teased every week because I would say, this is my favorite part every week. We collected sparklets to do Florilegia. We did Pardes. We engaged in Chavruta. I practiced all of the things Stephanie and I had discussed. I had people write sermons inspired by the text. Just really figuring out what it was then that treating a secular text as sacred was. And these women were all women who had left religion because of some kind of trauma with religion. And by that, I mean, one of them had lost her mother young. She was Catholic and lost her mother young. And she was really frustrated by how much everybody was telling her that it was okay because her mother was in a better place. And that just did not work for her as a young girl. She was like, I don't care. I want my mom with me. And she said that it actually made her feel guilty that she wasn't happy for her mom, that her mom had died. And so she was like, I'm not raising my children like that. She was a young mother and was like, this is not something I want to raise my children in, but I want to raise them thinking about how to be good and how to be in conversation with love. And so she was there, and everybody there had a similar story, which was eye-opening to me, because I thought, because my grandparents' story is so extreme, I thought I was sort of rare in that way. And it turns out that there are a lot of people like me. There are a lot of people who don't feel as though they can engage in religion and yet yearn to be in conversation with something bigger than them, in order to make them the most loving version of themselves, in order to engage in good in the world, in order to try to live in community. And so I was leading this class, and one week my friend Casper came to the class just to be supportive. He was a fellow student of mine at the divinity school, and he did the reading for the week, which we were like toward the end of the book, and he hadn't read the rest of it, but he did that week's reading, and sat and participated, and he was really wonderful. And at the end, we were sitting there and there was actually no electricity. It was around this time of year, whatever it was, like 7 years ago. And I'm sure you all remember, there was that winter that we got like 200 inches of snow anyway. And so the electricity was out regularly in Boston. And so it was freezing in the room that we were working in. It was dark. We were reading sections of Jane Eyre on our phones. And Casper and I were sitting there after the class, and he said, Vanessa, you're really onto something here. And he was studying nuns, N-O-N-E-S, nuns, unaffiliated people who still want to find themselves in some sort of spiritual community. And he was like, I think this would resonate with a lot of people, but I think that you need to do it with a book people actually want to read. And I was like, that's so rude. What book do people actually want to read? And he was like, the Harry Potter books. And I was like, that's not a terrible idea. Harry Potter is really special as far as treating a secular text as sacred. I do believe that you can treat anything. There are a couple of things, but if something is complicated, like if two people can look at the same thing and have three different ideas of what it is, and if it gets you closer to loving neighbor, right, to being committed to loving neighbor, I think you can treat it as sacred. I really do. I think that you can treat Game of Thrones as sacred, Dirty Dancing as sacred. I think that as long as it's generative, as long as it makes you want to keep thinking about what it would mean to be loving, I think you can treat it as sacred. However, I think Harry Potter happens to be especially equipped to be sacred. First of all, just when it was written at the same time as the rise of the internet, and therefore fan fiction being swapped at the exact same time in this like place of innocence of and lack of corruption, created a generation of people, my generation, and a little bit younger, I'm an old millennial, but young millennials grew up with this text being completely ubiquitous to them and being this constant source of celebration. The books would come out and there would be parties, and then the movies would come out and there would be parties, and there was this real ritual, right, like religious aspect to it. Kids would get dressed up and have community, and there was joy, and there was speculation as to what was going to happen, and there was deep textual analysis, right? These books were incredible. And now what's happening is my generation is raising their children on these books. And I know that's true for me. I have two beautiful stepdaughters, and some of the best conversations we have are about Harry Potter. It's my 8-year-old is obsessed with whether or not Mad-Eye Moody, when he is being imperious, well, not even imperious, when Barty Crouch Jr. is polyjuicing into Mad-Eye Moody's body, is Mad-Eye Moody a good teacher? And this is something that we talk about all the time, right? Intentions versus impact. Mad-Eye Moody like ended up being a good teacher in that moment. What does it mean that he didn't have good intentions? And this is something that we talk about in our house all the time. The other reason is the cross-cultural ubiquity of these books. Right? Like you don't have to speak the same language as someone, but if they're wearing like green and gold, you're like Slytherin, and that says something about them to you, right? And you can say Gryffindor, and that is a way to bond in this incredible way. And then the other thing that's so amazing about these books is that the lesson of the books is that love can protect us, right? It's anti-torture. It is anti-supremacy. Like, these books have incredible, incredible messages in them. As Casper and I decided that we were going to do a class treating Harry Potter as sacred. And I did my class Tuesday nights from 7 to 8:30 with Jane Eyre. 4 people came. Casper and I did it Wednesdays from 7 to 8:30. 80 people came. So just so you know, for programming, Wednesday nights are much clearer for people than Tuesday nights, because that was the lesson we took. And we learned so much during that first year that we led the class. The first one was that as leaders treating a text as sacred, and I know we have a lot of clergy here today, was how frequently we were going to betray our community. As I said, I was training to be a chaplain in a one-on-one setting that was really about listening, but leading a community became a totally different thing. I'm very anti the Hogwarts house system, for those of you who know about it. I think that we should not be sorting people at the age of 11 into character traits, and I find it very troubling. And I had one young woman come up to me crying that being a Slytherin was a really big part of her identity, and every time I was anti the house system, she equated it to me being homophobic. And I had to learn how to be like, I disagree. I do not think that is the same thing as being homophobic, but really accept that people, right, that as a leader, you are going to say things that hurt people, and what that line is on speaking things that you think are true, while also taking care of a community. The other thing was not just that we were going to betray people, but that we were going to go on a journey with people in which the text betrayed them. We had a lot of people of color in our group, and so when we met characters like Cho Chang or Parvati Patel, there were people who were hurt by those characters, and they were finally in a community of people who wanted to talk about that hurt, and so brought it to the group. And it was just a reminder that, right, even these special places that I go to treat as sacred because the Torah is too ragged for me, right? These other texts they're not perfect either, right? And it's about whether or not you can stand the betrayal of the text that you are dealing with enough to get to the work of learning to love neighbor by practicing with the text. And I would say that I can learn better from Harry Potter than from the Torah. But so the class was successful, and we had somebody by happenstance write an article in which we were mentioned. And so we started getting emails from all over the world saying, can I, like, this was before Zoom, so like, can I Skype into your class? And we were like, not really. You know, we like sat in circles a lot in order to do sacred practices, like little circles. And we were like, we don't know how that would work. And so our friend and professor, Matt Potts, was like, you guys should try doing a podcast. And we were like, oh, it's an interesting idea. And so it took us about 8 months to figure out what the podcast would sound like. We got paired up with this amazing woman named Ariana Nettleman, who agreed to produce and edit our podcast, even though she'd never produced or edited anything in her life. And so the 3 of us started this thing, and our first episode launched in May of 2016. So we were just on 5 years, and we decided that we were going to just do book 1, that we would read 1 chapter at a time through a theme. And so we started book 1 through the theme of commitment, because we were making this commitment. And so what we did was read each chapter through the theme of commitment. So in that very first chapter of Harry Potter, what are the Dursleys committed to? What is Professor McGonagall committed to? What do we think about commitment? Which of these commitments are good and which of them are bad? Who gets to decide which commitments are good and which commitments are bad? And we joke that every episode ends with commitment, or whatever the theme is, sometimes good, sometimes bad. Then we did fear and love and mercy. We ended up making it through all 199 chapters of Harry Potter, plus several episodes with voicemails. So we did about 250 episodes. We just ended our series of going through all 7 books. We, through luck, picked up almost 100,000 listeners. We have local groups all over the world. We have 80 local groups all over the world who meet on a weekly basis, now mostly obviously online, treating Harry Potter as sacred. At the very beginning, listeners started calling themselves a community, and we were like, no, you're not a community. Like, you are listeners who don't know each other. Community is about being able to bring each other soup, and community is about raising money for good causes. And they have just proven us completely wrong. They have formed an incredible community. We've raised over $60,000 for Raíces, and over $10,000 for Black Lives Matter related organizations last June. There was, we're running a mutual aid society over COVID for our listeners to be giving each other resources. And this, what to me really shows that we have been a community is 2 things. One is that the text has responded in difficult moments. The Pulse shooting happened at the beginning of us being a podcast. And so we decided that whenever something horrible like that happened and we could get it out to people in a reasonable time, we would try to respond with Harry Potter. And so for that, we read the speech that Dumbledore gives when Cedric Diggory dies, right? Remember Cedric Diggory. And the point of that being, don't let this death be a death that happens in vain. After Charlottesville, after George Floyd's murder, we have used the Harry Potter books in order to respond to the moment that we are living in. And what's been incredible is how well the books have withstood that. These books really can hold all of that space. But the other thing that we've had to go through is that not only has the text betrayed us, but the writer is still alive and she keeps talking. We have a very large queer listenership, and trans and non-binary employees and listeners. And J.K. Rowling, for those of you who don't know, really started speaking out anti-trans rights about 1.5 years ago. And so our community was deeply affected and hurt by that. And so we had to learn how to have a conversation with 100,000 people who we only know personally, a couple hundred of them. I can talk more if you all are interested in the Q&A about how we had that conversation, but sort of doing a podcast treating Harry Potter as sacred ended up being this much more involved thing than we thought it would be. We did not, we started the podcast in Obama's presidency, and our first live show was the day after the Women's March. We have since created a pilgrimage program. We have led over 200 pilgrims throughout England and the United States, treating various texts as sacred. We have gone to, we've done Little Women in Concord, which we've treated as sacred and walked in the footsteps of Louisa May Alcott. We have treated To the Lighthouse, Virginia Woolf's book, as sacred and walked around Sussex in her footsteps. Jane Eyre and Haworth, Jane Austen. We've traveled with many texts, not just Harry Potter. We have a Tuesday night community class on Zoom where we treat Harry Potter as sacred in sort of a congregational way. We ran a summer camp this past summer to try to offer some break in the monotony of COVID summer. This has really become a devotional community for us. And what is most amazing to me is the way that our community engages with this text. Many of them have tattoos of the Harry Potter, words or images, and they've changed the images in order to be more inclusive of trans people. They I mean, the emails and voicemails that we get from listeners using Harry Potter as sacred, and having them be in conversation with moments in their own lives. You know, someone's brother passed away and they are, you know, being held and kept company by the books, or, you know, someone making meaning of a past trauma in their lives. I actually no longer listen to voicemails because so many people share such intimate things with us that I was just a baby. I like found it I found it so difficult. I just found it horrible to listen. Usually if you're engaging with someone, you see their face and you know when they're about to say something awful. And I knew that it was time for me to stop listening to voicemails, because we did an episode on the theme of trauma. This is a funny story, I promise. And so we were getting just all of these voicemails from people talking to us about their traumas. And this young woman called in and said, you know, I listened to your episode and it really meant a lot to me. I have a trauma when I was 4 or 5, and I just braced myself. I was like, oh my God, what happened to this poor child? And she said, I was chased by a goose on the top of a picnic table, and I couldn't stop laughing from relief. I was like, obviously that is very traumatic if you're 4 or 5, but like, I was just imagining. And then I started sobbing from relief. So I am no longer the person who listens to voicemails, because that is an emotional roller coaster that I can't go on. But our community, this is all to say that our community makes meaning of this text in incredible ways on a constant basis. And so one last thing that I'll say is that we always end every season, every last chapter of every book is the only time we repeat themes, and we always end on love. And that is because when I was trained to preach, I was trained that you always preach toward love, you end on love. And so that is something that we are committed to doing. And our community, I think, teaches us how to do that in more and more radical ways, but always using these Harry Potter books. And so we now have a podcast called The Real Question, where we are engaging in similar practices, but every week we change the texts that we are engaging in. We bring big questions like, what does it mean to be a good neighbor? But we are always, or what is evil? Or, you know, what is body positivity? And we're trying to always bring different texts to it, because we don't think Harry Potter is for everyone. And we also want to demonstrate that it's not perfect. But yeah, it's been a really meaningful experience treating secular things as if they were sacred. I'll stop there because I know it's time for questions. So I'm happy to take any questions, Naomi. Yeah, however you all do it. You unmute yourselves and ask questions. I'm happy to do that.
I have a question.
Yes.
Do you think the fact that you are using text that nobody really accepts as authoritative is really a power? Because sometimes I think that religion, there's some, you know, even some Christians that think every word in the Bible is absolutely inviolable, but yet you are looking at texts knowing that they're written even by a flawed human being, and dialoguing with them and coming to your own sacred conclusions, not based on a revealed thing that has to be 100% true. Do you think that's the power of what you do, or part of it?
I definitely think it's part of it. You know, it's, I always thought it would be a really exciting time to be a Jew, the time that like Talmud and Mishnah, right, like were being written. Mm-hmm. And it feels like that, right? Like we are in conversation with the text and deciding how these texts can be read. I will say we try very much to not treat the texts as if they're perfect, but we always try to read them generously. So we never like look for plot holes. So an example in the Harry Potter books is that in book 1, chapter 1, Albus Dumbledore apparates onto the streets of Little Whinging, and it's silent. He appears silently. And later in the books, we find out the apparition is very loud, that there's a loud crack and you can hear it from really far away. And obviously, between you and me, J.K. Rowling, right, like figured out that she wanted apparition to have a loud crack after she wrote the very first chapter. And we even see Dumbledore apparate loudly later in the books. And so part of me could be like, right, this thing that I just said, J.K. Rowling changed her mind. But the point is to look for potential meaning, to practice the empathy and understanding. And so one of the possible readings is that we only see Dumbledore apparate loudly once he's injured. We only see him apparate one other time, and he's severely injured and dying. And so maybe at the beginning of the books, he was strong and powerful, and he was the only wizard who could apparate silently, right? And that was a power that he lost as he aged and got injured. And so, yes, I think it's a gift, but I'm not sure. I think that within religion, part of treating texts as sacred is being critical of them and not taking every word of them whole hog and literally. And so I don't always know. I think it's more at the forefront of our minds because we can look and be like, J.K. Rowling, who lives in that castle in Scotland, wrote these books. But I'm not sure that it's totally different from how people engage with traditionally sacred texts. Thank you for that question, Martha.
So one of my favorite parts of the podcast is when you say blessings for each of the characters. And I was just wondering if you could speak to that a little more.
Yeah, it was Casper's idea, which is why, I don't like talking about Casper's idea. I'm just kidding. Casper's idea was that we should always end every episode of Harry Potter and the Sacred Text by offering a blessing. We practiced offering blessings to each other. And that is audio that we just found and hadn't heard in 6 years. And it's horrifying. It's like so vulnerable and awkward. And so we changed it to blessing a character at the end of every chapter. I would say that it was one of the hardest things for me because in Judaism, blessings are pre-written. My father or grandfather would bless us every Friday night. And it's like the same blessing that you give to children every meal. And so extemporaneous blessings is just like not something that I grew up with. And I was very anxious about it. But so it was something that we really worked hard to define for ourselves what it meant. And it was that we wanted to call attention to something in the character that we think might be overlooked, either good or bad. So we want to bless someone for their strength in a moment that not a lot of people might have noticed that they were being strong, but that must have been really difficult for them. And then we also sometimes bless characters. So for example, Hermione, who I like to bless all the time, that when she fights a troll, at the end of that chapter, she hasn't just been attacked by a troll, but she also breaks a rule for her first time. She lies to authority. And so I blessed her for like the really difficult lesson of like, you can't always be honest with authority, and you have to figure out when there are moments that it's, in my opinion, really important to lie to authority sometimes. And so I blessed her for that. But we also bless characters for things, for missteps that they make, for, I have a commitment to only blessing women on the podcast, which we are about to start the podcast over, and I will no longer be doing that. But if I were to bless Draco Malfoy, right, he is a coward again and again, and it is very frustrating to read. But I can imagine blessing him for that because I too am a coward again and again. And so, right, a blessing for Draco might look like, I know you're a coward again and again, but I hope better for you. And I hope every day you are stretching the muscle of courage. So in offering these blessings to characters, we are trying to offer blessings to ourselves and to our community as well. And it's a lovely way to end the podcast. And most of the voicemails that we get at this point are listeners calling in and blessing characters, which is really lovely.
So I am a huge fan of the podcast. It really, really have enjoyed it so thoroughly. You and Casper are just funny, and I love the way you compete with each other. The only part that I feel sad on is that it is sort of like what you said. It's all, you listen and you can become so connected. Like, you didn't know this, but we're really good friends.
Yeah.
In my head. So that's the only part for me that I wish there was a face-to-face community. So can you share, you said you've heard of other groups that have started up, how they did it? And because I have gotten so much out of listening in, and that's my only, I just want face-to-face, and I'd love to see if maybe I could do it here in Darien with St. Luke's.
Yes, I am going to pull up our local groups page. So at the top of every episode, we announce a local group. So our local groups, we have a website with like how to do it. We have an intern who will help you do it. You can just email us and say, I want to start a local group. And that's really all it takes. We will help you find other people in your area. We have several Zoom local groups that are going on right now. Usually they are local to an area, but we have a couple, like in bigger cities, we have 2 or 3 groups. Like in Portland, Oregon, they have 3 local groups. But really, it takes 2 people coming together, and every group operates a little bit differently. Some groups do chunks of chapters, like 5 chapters at a time. When we ran our first group, we in every school year would get through all 7 books. So that comes to 9 chapters. Yeah, they all do it a little bit differently. Some of them have 1 facilitator, some of them rotate having facilitators, some of them have 3 or 4 people, some of them, whenever I travel for a live show, I try to go to a local group meeting, and the Chicago group has over 50 people. Our group in Latvia has 8, who knew? So it really is just about you and one other person, and then finding others. We have a big Facebook group where you can post, this is where I am. I would drive up to 10 miles. Would anybody like to do it with me? And you will most likely pretty quickly find some other people who will do it with you. And if not, there are a bunch of online ones. The one that I like the name of best is the Zoom of Requirements. So meets weekly online.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's a competition that our groups have started with each other. Is we announce the name of a group at the top of every episode, and if the name is creative enough, it gets my former co-host Casper to giggle, and so people try to come up with more and more creative names for their local groups to get Casper to laugh. We also mock groups with overly boring names. We're mean. I'm mean. Any other questions? Derek?
Yeah, one of the things that I've sort of been thinking about as a connection to this community, St. Luke's, is a term that I think a lot of us on the call are familiar with from our time with the St. John's Bible, which is spiritual imagination. Mm-hmm. One of the tasks of the St. John's Bible is to ignite and to foster spiritual imagination. And I've sort of been coming back to that as you've been speaking, because what you're suggesting, I think, has that same potential to do just that in a different way, obviously. But that's more of a comment than a question. But maybe you can have some commentary on that topic. Spiritual imagination.
I have 2 things to say. One is one of the spiritual practices that we do is based on the Jesuit tradition of Ignatian imagination. So we call it sacred imagination. We slightly alter all the spiritual practices. Lectio Divina, the 4th step is, what does God call you to? We drop the God language. But and the idea of sacred imagination is, right, just like St. Ignatius of Loyola wanted people to be imagining themselves onto the boats with Jesus and like feel the tackle in their hands and feel the possibility that a prophet was right in front of you. We want people to be in the room with Harry while he's being humiliated in order to practice empathy of what it would be like to love someone so much that you feel their pain as if it was your own. And the, imagination is Virginia Woolf famously said that war is a lack of imagination. If we could imagine what a soldier's inner life was, we would never be able to shoot at them. And I think that's right. I think so. Imagination is an anti-war effort, right? And then there are interesting lines, you know, on Edith Stein, who I'm a bad person. I never remember what her Catholic name was. She converted to Catholicism. Does anyone know? And she became beatified after World War II. Anyway, she was born as a Jewish woman, was killed in the Holocaust, and then became a Catholic saint. But she has a theory on empathy that if you overly empathize with somebody, you risk erasure, right? If you say too much of your own story, if you too radically imagine yourself into the other person, what you're actually doing is imposing your story onto them. You have to be asking questions and in relationship with someone to empathize in sort of an appropriate way, except that I would say that erasure is better than war, right? So I think that there are times in which a completely imaginative empathy that is entirely made up is actually a really important tool, and that this more intimate empathy is, you know, is what community is, right? Where you ask questions and empathize based on information. But yes, I am pro, what was the word you used? Spiritual imagination?
Spiritual imagination. Yeah, that's what
Spiritual
St. John's Bible people
Yeah, I love that.
view as one of their main goals.
Yeah, I think I agree with that.
I have a question about
Yes.
your choice of books. Our whole family is Harry Potter fans. Like, we're totally addicted. The other one we like is Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Like,
My husband would be right there with you.
and,
Whenever
you know,
he says something that I think is witty, I'm like, that's a Douglas Adams quote, isn't it?
exactly,
Like,
exactly.
yes.
So, you know, but these are fiction versus nonfiction.
Mm-hmm.
So I wondered if there was, you know, for this practice, whether nonfiction is harder to fit in versus fiction. And, you know, just in terms of what I'll say is the freedom the author has to craft a story and, you know, take it in different directions, where nonfiction, it's almost like, at least from what I understand of your past, is your non-fictional past, the reality of it, right, was so horrific that you couldn't take the religious, you know, books, which, you know, theory are the word of God, as something to work with. So I'd just be curious about how you responded to that, how that influences kind of this practice, if you will.
Yeah, we're practicing now for the first time using nonfiction texts in our new podcast, The Real Question. And we're only doing it with sparklets of text, with 1 or 2 sentences at a time. We give larger context to, you know, we explain what the article or the book is about. And we say, but this is the snippet of text we want to treat as sacred. And again, I would say if it gets you better at loving, if it's generative, if you and I can have different nuanced ideas of what that means and how we would live it out in the world, I absolutely think that you can treat it as sacred. I would argue that the Holocaust, right, is, I mean, like, nothing rises from ash but ash, right? Like I mean, there are a lot of different ways to think about it, but, you know, there's the John Adams quote that I'll paraphrase, right? Like, I am a warrior, so my son can be a politician, so my grandson can be an artist, right? I feel like I'm an atheist, so my children like don't have to be. I think that to me, it's not that I think that the Bible can't be treated as sacred. It's that the Bible's too difficult for me to treat as sacred, just like for, you know, a lot of queer, you know, people, the church is a very upsetting place for them to return. And, you know, just because of their childhood, not because there aren't churches out there that are wonderful, but because of an experience that they had when they were young. We have a young woman who's a member of our community who, her pastor wouldn't officiate her wedding because she was on an antidepressant. And he said that he doesn't know if she's really consenting to the marriage or if the drug is telling her to do it. And that had really bad ramifications in her life. And so, right, she knows that there are good pastors out there who won't do it, but she has a real problem with that authority. And so I would say the problem isn't the Bible, right? It's not the text. I think we can treat nonfiction text as sacred. And I obviously think treating traditionally religious text as sacred can be done beautifully and well. I think it's that people have been hurt by the codification of the church and, you know, synagogue, the church, capital C. And so they can't return to those texts. But I think most of them sort of hope that in the future they will be able to, or that sort of their children will be able to. I still love Bible stories. We did a big Seder the other night, and we opened the door for Elijah, and the kids love yelling, you know, anyone who wants to can come in. Right. And we very much talk about Elijah as a metaphor for, you know, you never know when you're talking to a prophet. So like we very much still live a ritualistically religious life. And my partner is not Jewish. And so the following weekend we did Easter chocolate all over the house. So yeah, to me, it's about whether or not people can find community and love, and rather treating something as sacred is difficult work, as you all know. And if you're going through the extra hurdle of having to forget some emotional trauma, I think that it becomes extra hard. So we're just inviting people to do it with a text that's easy for them to love. And now Harry Potter has become difficult for some people to love. And so we invite them to move on to another text.
Vanessa, I want to thank you, because I think from within the Christian tradition, one of the things we believe is that the whole world has the power to connect us to God and to each other.
Right.
And often as religious people, it can get shrunk into 1 hour or one text or one experience. And I think what the work you're doing in inviting people to see God's hand and the possibility for loving community in all sorts of ways is very beautiful. So thank you.
Thank you. I will say we're starting with book 1, chapter 1 in 2 weeks. And my co-host will be an Episcopal priest, so who very much tries to live his life in conversation with Christ. So we're excited to go on that. He's also one of my best friends, so I'm not anxious about how that will go. I think it'll go just fine. But yeah. Thank you so much, everybody, for having me, especially Naomi, for organizing it. I'm very grateful.
Thank you so much. This has been so wonderful. So thank you.
My pleasure.
Any final questions before we go?
Round of applause for my dog who didn't bark for this whole hour. I know. It's the first time it's happened in a while.
Although we would have loved it regardless.
Round of applause for the dog at the dog park who exhausted her this morning. So she's too tired to bark right now. So. Well, thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you all. And thank you, Vanessa.
Bye.
Bye.